if you're not spending a significant amount of time working inside these manufacturing facilities, I'm not talking about states away or countries away or your ivory tower. I'm talking about inside the four walls of that plant. That's how I can tell whether somebody really has a pretty good bead on what's going on and be able to solve these kinds of problems versus somebody that's never been or goes once a year or every other year and they're there for a couple of days to work on some business system at the plant. That is not the group that's going to solve this problem.
Welcome to the Industrial Cybersecurity Insider. In each episode, we dive into the world of industrial cybersecurity. Join us as we cover the latest trends, innovations, and practical insights as we talk with leaders and practitioners across the industry. Gear up and let's get into this week's episode. Welcome to the show. My name is LuRae Lumpkin, and I'm the producer of the Industrial Cybersecurity Insider podcast. And today, Dino Busalaki is joining me to discuss why our ecosystem partners are our greatest cybersecurity asset and what companies can do to leverage those relationships. So, Dino, welcome to the show.
Thanks, LuRae.
So we're going to start with a series of topics that you, I know, have significant experience with. When it comes to manufacturers, they're already spending money with system integrators. They've got technology partners. Why aren't they leveraging those relationships today?
That's a great question. It's almost like it's just one opinion, meaning that, because we've had conversations with, IT leadership around cybersecurity for their industrial environments, their OT environment. And sometimes their position is vague enough that they don't really have a really good understanding, or they don't believe or feel that those OT assets need to be a part of their cybersecurity strategy or their journey. And again, that's one opinion, right? And the conversation in a lot of cases never goes above and beyond that, meaning that, well, why don't we ask that of the people that actually operate and run the plants, like a plant manager, for example, or the engineering teams, to find out if they would feel the same of kind of being left out, or at least help them understand why cybersecurity for their control systems is important, right? So that they can actually start thinking for themselves and start figuring out, how can I do a better job of securing and protecting these control systems in my environment? As we all know, years past, security wasn't designed in to these machine centers. It just wasn't part of it because there's still a belief that these environments are air gapped. It's just not the case anymore. And any IT leadership, that's recognizes that just based on the amount of data that they get up and off the plant floor and the remote access that they had to put in, like during the pandemic, in order for people to support them, because people couldn't travel, right, in order to keep those manufacturing facilities up and running. So the key is, in my view, is trying to get to the no. The question is, do you believe that you should be executing and implementing the same cybersecurity strategies, for the control system environment, the OT environment, as you do the enterprise, right? Or your due diligence. And part of that due diligence would be tapping in to probably the greatest resource that you're unaware of. It's working in your plants on a pretty regular, consistent basis, helping maintain and support those machine centers for your plants to be able to produce the goods that they produce. And that is your system integrators and your OEMs. Because a lot of manufacturers don't even have controls engineers. They hire that out. And we know that because that's the business that we're in. That's the business I am in, right? Working for organizations like that and have for decades. And we don't have IT executives tapping into that, trying to find out who we are, what are our partners, what are our capabilities, what kind of practices do you have, what kind of resources do you have to help them with their cybersecurity strategy. So either they don't have one for the plant floor, or they don't want to own it. It's one of the two. There's probably a third, option out there, but I don't see them doing that. And I work with, and my social circles in this space are pretty broad, with the top partners, the Cisco Systems, the Rockwell Automations, the Siemens, the Clarities, the Nozomis, the Armises, the TX1s, Microsoft, and go down the list. And the same challenge that we're talking about right now, they would say that is a challenge. That IT-OT convergence, as everybody likes calling it, is not true convergence.
Right. Absolutely. So if you're going to help a CISO, like, or a plant manager even take inventory, like, of their existing partners and figure out who to start the security conversations with first, like, what is the best practice to even get started with that?
Well, contact your plant leadership and find out who those people are, right? And try to get an idea of what they're working on. And in a lot of cases, these system integrators have been working in your manufacturing facilities for decades and still are, right? They're the ones who design the machines, they program them, they maintain and support them, they help you with changeovers, they help you with maintenance, they help you with a whole expansions, life cycle replacement, whatever the case may be. There's an engagement of system integrators working in your plants today. They all have varying degrees of capabilities and partnerships with regards to technology. I would probably argue that if you look across the system integrator, landscape, you're only going to find a handful or a dozen that even have practices related to cybersecurity for the industrial environment. So, I remember a very distinct story some years ago. It's been over close to a decade ago when WannaCry came out. And I was working for a very large automation technology vendor here in the United States. And we were meeting with a client and to go talk to them about networks and security because the engineering team they knew that they needed to do something different for the security and the segmentation of their network in their plants. And this was a dairy company. They were a big dairy company. And meeting with the CIO, and this is a client that did over $10 million worth of business with that automation technology vendor in the course of a year. I would challenge that any of your IT partners that you spend that much money with them in a year, but you do spend a lot of money, your plants do, buying this technology and the services that come with it for your manufacturing facilities. But the response that I got back from that CIO, that we should have probably been like your second phone call to figure out how we could help you with this event that you had going on. And they didn't know who we were. The response I got back was duly noted. And my point is that, you're missing out on the resources that you need if you truly are going after an OT cybersecurity strategy that fits in with your enterprise plan, and you're not tapping into probably the best resources available to you to do that because it's not your plant people. That's not their skill. That's not what they're there to do. Their job is to keep that plant up and running and generate revenue. That's their job. It's not to be cybersecurity expert. It's not to be control systems experts. It's not to be networking experts. They're not that. You got to go to the people who are designing and building and implementing that stuff.
You've got the roster of these are all of the technologies that you're able to identify. Like, what does the first conversation look like? What does that sound like if it's around cybersecurity? How do you broach that subject and get into what is important to be talking about?
Yeah, asset inventory, right? The very first thing, do you have an accurate, up-to-date asset inventory of all the things that are connected to your network, and not just in your enterprise world, but on in your plants? And I would probably venture to say that most IT organizations probably have a pretty good grasp of what's connected to their network in their business systems, but not so much on their control systems, not so much on the OT side, not inside those plants. They don't. So that's the first thing that you need to try to get your arms around, just to find out just the number of assets that I have. And then from there, what are the risks and vulnerabilities associated with those assets based on their firmware version, their life cycle status, the end of life and the support, so you can start at least getting a picture of what you got out there. And then from there, you can start, going after. So that's the reveal piece, right? That's revealing. Before you can go to protect, you got to be able to reveal, what you have, what's connected. When you get to step two, what is connected? Now that I've got my asset inventory, what's connected? What's talking to what? And understanding those communication flows. Are they valid connections and communications per se? Are they valid applications that should be in the environment? Services, right? Before you can get into into detecting and responding, your IR plan and all of those other things, before you can start implementing a strategic plan forward, you got to get to that reveal factor, and that's step one, right? And so that's the first question. Are you doing that today? And can you show that? If you came up to somebody, if you had an audit that you had to pass or go through, Would you be able to demonstrate that?
Well, then I think that the other thing that automatically makes me think of is remote access, because we kind of opened Pandora's box with COVID, and now the warranties and, all of the things that come along with implementing a new cybersecurity piece of equipment or just equipment, period. Like, your warranty will be void if you don't allow remote access. So how do companies even get their arms around that?
Well, you got to be able to detect that, right? You got to be able to detect that's even happening. And then once that connection is allowed for remote access, what are they doing? Are you watching them? Are you providing some type of audit on that? Do you have change control? If somebody makes a control system change, can they just do it willy-nilly, shoot from the hip? Or is there a process to get through to make that change? And you're not going to be able to do that without visibility. And if you don't have the asset in an inventory to determine what its state is and what it's supposed to be doing and what it's supposed to be communicating with and what applications are supposed to be working with it, those are all the things that you have to uncover in order to validate what is a valid action versus something that's not valid. When you look at these bad actors, they sit inside these environments for close to 300 days. What is it, 280 to 300 days? They're sitting in there. So for almost a year, they're embedded in your environment, just watching and listening and moving around silently. And you don't even know they're there because you are not looking at that stuff with the same lens that you're trying to look at in your enterprise, with the tools that you have and the resources that you have.
Yeah, and I'm wondering also, how often do you run into organizations where they'll say precursory, oh yeah, we invested in cybersecurity, we've checked the box and they basically covered themselves for the board and the C-suite, but really it's not been operationalized. How do you address that?
But it goes back to what I said earlier. That's one opinion, right? Would the folks that are the true asset owners, so to speak, the people that operate the plants, that run those plants, would they say the same thing? Would their opinion match that box checker who says I'm in compliance, right? Because we know if you're not spending a significant amount of time working inside these manufacturing facilities, I'm not talking about states away or countries away or your ivory tower. I'm talking about inside the four walls of that plant. That's how I can tell whether somebody really has a pretty good bead on what's going on and be able to solve these kinds of problems versus somebody that's never been or goes once a year or every other year and they're there for a couple of days to work on some business system at the plant. That is not the group that's going to solve this problem. Again, that's one opinion, right? When I hear that IT person says, we don't need that. I don't need to have visibility to those PLCs and those drives and those HMIs. Again, that's one opinion. So you have to flip the narrative, because get back to the no. Okay, IT, are you going to do this or not? Are you capable of doing it? Because if you're not, I have to go down a different path, right? Either way, even the client, the plant would still go to their trusted advisors. And who is that? It's the people they buy this stuff from, the people who help maintain and support it. That would be their natural pivot. They're not going to get on the phone, and I don't see a plant manager or an operations team calling Cisco Systems, for example. They're not going to do that. They wouldn't even know where to begin. They have to go through IT to even get there, ideally. But if they called Rockwell or Siemens, that'd be a different conversation. Or if they went to their system integrator that they've been working with for 20 years and spent tens of millions of dollars with, who's working with them today, they could go talk to them.
Right. Yeah. So what's really like at stake for a manufacturer? They've already invested, money into equipment, but they're treating like the relationships like it's just a transaction, like a vendor relationship instead of a partnership. Like, what's really at stake for them not having those relationships solidly in place?
You mean with the system integrators per se? From an IT perspective, from an OT perspective, they have that, right? That's who they go to. And that plant is sideways or casters up and not running, and the plant can't quite figure it out themselves. They're going to go to the people that designed and built and maintains and supports that equipment, right? That's who they're going to get on the phone or get on site to help solve that problem. Is that IT's problem? I don't think so. I don't think they would ever say that's their problem. Whatever took the plant down, right? Even if it was malware, if there's malware in your control systems, is it IT's job to eradicate it? Would they even know where to start? Because what I will tell you is they haven't run any exercises to figure out how to do that. They don't have the tools in there, right? Because we can tell whether they have the tools in there to do that type of discovery and research and investigation and provide that type of response and incident, recovery activities. We would know because we'd be a part of it. We'd have to be a part of it. We already are a part of it. If that machine goes down, we're the second phone call that's made. If the local guys can't fix it, they got their 800 number of who they need to call to get on the horn to help them out. And so again, what is the purpose of ITOT convergence? I hear it all the time. I'm not discounting it, but I just don't see it.
Action for anyone listening, like how do they start tapping into the partners that they're already paying for? And how can they start doing that?
Yeah. You need to find out who the contacts are at these organizations, these system integrators who are working in your plants, and meet with them and bring them in, or go to them and sit down and tell me, what you're doing for me on an annual basis. What are your capabilities? Who are your partners? What kind of resources do you have? What kind of practices do you have? To better understand their role, because you could leverage that. You really could. There's a lot of companies out there that try to self-perform, and I've seen that not work very well because you just don't have the resources to do it, or the experience to do it, or the maturity to be able to do it. And even then, if you're a fairly large manufacturer, large meaning that you got, let's say, 50 plants or 25 plants, well, you know how many people you would need in your organization to be able to do that? You need at least one or two per site on average just to get this stuff in and start that discovery process. Now that I've got the discovery process, I'm starting to map out my vulnerabilities and risks to determine how I'm going to prioritize this stuff, and start localizing it and operationalizing it and make it actionable, and start determining what areas are we going to target. That all has to be done at the local level, you know? And so you think about the number of people that you need, it's pretty significant, and you're not going to pull it off with just a couple of people or one person, you know? I was just talking to an organization earlier this week, and I knew that they knew nothing about the OTIDS types of cybersecurity platforms. I could just tell because they didn't recognize any of the technology firms I was talking about. And the next response was, well, that's 18 months to 2 years out before we, again, that's one person's opinion. And why? And so you have to really ask yourself, is that sufficient? And it's not, right? It's not as sufficient that it's one person or one group's opinion. It has to come from across the business for the people that are truly responsible for plant operations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because there's the ownership, there's the group that pays for it, and then there's okay, we need to put this into effect and leverage it. And as we've talked about in many different episodes, there are not enough people, as you just said a little bit ago. There just aren't enough people with existing teams. They're already spread thin, and they need additional ancillary support by people who know and have done this before. So they're not running blind. IT doesn't really know. They're trying to do the right thing. But then the OT people are spread thin and not always empowered or even have access to the data that is coming through the machines.
Yeah, they don't even have access to it, even for those firms that have implemented something. Maybe seeing a third of their assets or half of their assets in their plant. There's still no actionable activities going not only to the plant teams, but again, back to the system integrators and OEMs who are operating and maintaining that equipment also. Because again, we would know. We'd be getting targets, right? We'd be getting metrics. We would be getting things we might have to design into that next machine center that's coming in to make sure that you have visibility to all of that stuff. And there'd be a baseline on the firmware versions or the operating system level or the application versions to what you're going to put in my plan. And this is how the network's going to be set up. We're going to segment this piece of equipment. Here's how we're going to do that. They would have it all mapped out, and they just don't. And when I say they, I'm talking about 80 to 90% of them out there.
So, what's your final words of advice for anyone who's trying to make sure? Okay, we don't want the operation to go down. We don't want anything to happen, or I'm in charge of this and we bought something and I think it's okay. Like, what would be your final words of advice to someone out there trying to make sense of all this?
But how to get better? Let's do something to get better. The first thing I'd look at is you might think about doubling or tripling your cybersecurity budget. Because in most cases, the IT cybersecurity budget, once the budget's been set, 70+% of it's already spent, the first day. Right. And so there's never enough to go tackle 50 plants, 30 plants, 10 plants, whatever you got, to begin this journey, into driving cybersecurity further and deeper into my environment. So ideally for me, I've always been interested, why aren't the IT executives probing and asking those questions to the system integrators and OEMs that are the primary deliverer of the equipment that you have, the technology that you have, the maintenance and support of that is in the hands of a third party. Why don't you have your fingers into that? And I'd love to hear a response from a CIO or a CISO to that question. And part of me is sitting there going, they're like, I don't want any part of it, or I don't really have the responsibility. I can't control what they do.
And what you said made me think of two things. One, every organization knows what an hour of downtime, a day of downtime, what that cost is. So if you're looking to prove in the ROI of an investment in cybersecurity protection for your production, your revenue generating equipment and facilities, look at that. And the second thing is cybersecurity insurance isn't going to save you.
It might help with remediation, but it's not going to help you with your losses from business operations, that's for sure.
But if you take those two pieces and have to prove in the ROI, okay, well, if we get hit and we're down for a day or more, there you can look out there at the visible cyber events that have happened and the loss. And we've touched on this before, like what happened to Jaguar Land Rover affected the GDP of the country. So it can have a huge effect.
Yeah, look what happened to Stryker just recently, right? And they happen every month. They happen every day. But just every month, somebody makes the news, right? But a lot of it happens every single day. A lot of smaller companies, private companies that don't have to announce that they've had a breach are just either paying the ransomware or they're just taking the hit and spending weeks or months, a year trying to get back on their feet, depending on how bad the hit was, right? So, so it happens every day. And somehow we got to get past whoever believes that they're holding the cards to try to do this are not making their way to where they need to be. So like the consulting organizations that, somebody that the IT people will rely on. So take your pick of some of these big consulting firms or even the big IT VARs that are selling this technology to them. They are not helping with the strategic direction and strategy on how to really drive this down into your plants, into that last mile, And so you either don't think the last mile is relevant or important. Again, that's one opinion, right? Back to that one opinion, or you really don't understand it. And if you don't understand it, then you need to start talking to people who do, right? And get that second opinion or third opinion.
I think the summary of this is know who your system integrators are, have relationships with those people. Don't just write the check and then forget until the renewal comes up. Have relationships with them, have conversations with them.
Yeah, I mean, again, it'd be really good to hear, from a CIO or a CISO from a large manufacturing company, any size really, why aren't you tapping in to one of the greatest resources available to help you with this? Why are you ignoring that?
Time to take action now. Don't wait until it's too late.
It's not that they won't work with you, and not every system integrator you're going to have in your plant is going to be at a certain maturity or sophistication level around this OT cybersecurity, right? But you might have one or two. And if you don't have them, then you need to find some that do, again, that work in this space. Don't just go off to an IT VAR that provisions, cybersecurity equipment. I've seen boxes stacked at the plant that never got implemented because they couldn't do it. IT couldn't do it. And the plant didn't have time to do it, didn't know what it was for, and wasn't just going to throw something on the network hoping that it wasn't going to be disruptive to their operation. But they would work with somebody that they see every day who's working on their plant floor and putting technology on their network. They'll work with those guys.
So I think we always say, you don't have to go it alone. You don't have to do this by yourself. And if you don't have the expertise in-house, reach out. Dino's available to have a conversation. So thank you so much, Dino.
Thanks, LuRae. See you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to the Industrial Cybersecurity Insider. To stay up to date with our latest episodes, be sure to click the follow or subscribe button now. And if you found this podcast helpful or have a topic you'd like us to discuss, please leave us a review or let us know. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.